All right, and I believe we should be live as of now. Um, it looks like it did not connect it to the other link, but oh well. We'll go ahead and pin this other one. And cool. I think we are officially live. Some folks may or may not start popping in. Oh, cool. We'll hide that. Awesome. Well, I'm sure it'll take a minute for folks to trickle on in, but because we'll be able to play this back later, we'll just go ahead and kick off. I'm Austin, founder of Gauntlet AI. We train engineers to use AI and wield all of its powers. And Palmer here was one of the students in our first cohort, which started in January and ended in April. And as a part of Gauntlet AI, we've been looking at all sorts of different AI development workflows, how people are building stuff, how they structure everything, how they feed information to the agent they're using or the model that they're using, how they don't, how they structure everything. And I think I've probably seen hundreds and hundreds of these different workflows, and I think I've asked maybe 1,000 people about how they do it. And I think Palmer's was probably the most impressive of all of those that I've seen. Not to put you on the spot, Palmer, but I guess that is why we're here to some extent. Palmer was an engineer in the blockchain space before he joined us. And before that, he was a professional baseball player. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, you can say that.
So we're super excited to have Palmer with us. I'm going to mostly shut up and let Palmer drive, and he's going to walk us through all sorts of stuff. So when he starts a project, when he's managing a project, how does he control it all? What does his workflow look like? How does he manage his context window? All that fun stuff. And I will be monitoring the chats, and if there's anything interesting, we'll pop it over to Palmer. And then if we've got a little time, we'll close out with some Q&A. But for right now, we'll turn the time over to Palmer.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me. I know we've talked about doing this for a while, and so I'm glad we're making it happen. Yeah, so on on the topic of this being the most impressive workflow, it's definitely the one that's best for me, but I've seen a lot of others that I think are equally like very, very strong. So before we get into any of it, I want to stress like everyone should find their own thing that works best for them. We've seen, countless people do different things in Gauntlet. And I see a new thread on Twitter every day about someone's AI workflow. And I believe that they're all like really, really solid. If anything, I think mine is like simplified, and that's why it's been really reliable for me. So yeah, we'll go into it. I think could help a lot of people. Austin, like even I know you've had me show this to a couple like hiring partners and stuff, and I think a lot of this stuff is like standard Gauntlet knowledge. We all come out of the program thinking like, okay, this is very normal. But every time I show it to someone outside, they're like, oh, this is great. This is exactly what we needed, right? So yeah, we'll get into it a little bit. Um, so yeah, I'm not the most technical person compared to some of the people we had in Gauntlet, and so this is great for me. It starts very simple. We start with like kind of the project overview, and then we work our way into getting like a whole project together. Um, so I'll pull up this document that we'll get into in just a second. It's the new project setup doc. Austin, do you still have the link for this, by the way? If not, I can find it on GitHub. But I have this put into its own repo so that people can clone it if they'd like.
Yeah, I'll find it and share it out.
Sweet. Before we go into these steps, because I think they can be kind of boring, wanted to also share like, so we've got some people that are very, very technical, right? Who prefer full control over everything that they're doing. That's great. I think this is good for kind of like middle ground people to lower people, but at the same time, you can have a lot more control over these documents than just what the AI is going to spit out. So, to each their own, but take it all with a grain of salt.
Yeah, so walk us through these documents and tell us what they are and what you're doing with them. Kind of start at the top and
Totally.
read some of those names off.
So this is designed for like starting from complete scratch. You have only an idea of what you want to build in your project. So it's a step-by-step, essentially prompt guide where I've laid out kind of, how many is this? 12-ish steps that you should go through to get the entire, what I consider like the scaffolding put together for your project. So we've got the project overview, which everyone should probably start with before they're writing anything. It's just your project's purpose, goals, whatever, all the loose features that you're going to have. Then from there, you pop into the user flow, which kind of defines the journey through the application. This is good for planning out your routes. This is good for kind of seeing your project come to life and kind of what do you call it, like navigation structure, so that the AI can have a better understanding of how the different features will interact with one another. Then you get into the tech stack, which is what I would consider to be the most important document. This covers all the different things that you're actually building your project with. So all the libraries, packages, all that good stuff. The UI and theme rules I've found very useful for creating like a cohesive theme throughout the project. So when you ask the AI to generate a new component, right, or a new page, giving it these theme rules and the UI rules can make sure that it's pretty close to anything else you have in the rest of your code base without linking all the other stuff, right? So these are just kind of like some great sources of truth for your code base. Project rules for the naming conventions, for the file structure. This helps the AI know exactly where it needs to place new files and folders within your directory. Uh, they're making progress every day on like what's included in context. Like even now, I think you guys can see my cursor window. But even now in here somewhere, they've got like the ability to include your entire, maybe here, your entire directory. It's been a while since I looked through it, and they change it every day. But yeah, it's somewhere in here. You can include your folder. Yeah, here we go. Full folder context, right? Um, Kind of the ability for you to include actual like folder content and stuff instead of just the files. But especially back in the day, and even still now, having this is really useful for consistent outputs. And then the phase doc. Uh, there's a lot of rage around checklists right now. It's interesting because originally checklists were like a really hot thing and it was super useful. And then the AI kind of started getting overly eager to update checklists. So I would consider them to have kind of fallen off a bit over like the last several months. And then this month, they've kind of picked back up where the context windows have expanded and the model capabilities have improved. So now actionable checklists are like kind of hot again. So that's good.
Okay,
I like the checklist approach.
so you have all these docs. Are you just literally creating, markdown files in the parent directory of your app, and then, or like, where does all this live?
Yeah, so I have this docs folder. I name it with an underscore just so it stays at the top of the hierarchy. Uh, Otherwise, it would fall kind of down here. Like if you have a client directory, it'd get sandwiched or something. So up here, I populate this with all of the documents that I've mentioned here, and then any additional documents that I want to have for my project. So through these steps, there's instructions on where to put those documents. So the AI will generate all of these for me, right? So we start out with project overview. I recommend always having at least a project overview. If you don't, just pop over into the window and give the AI a rough explanation of what you're doing. But actually, for my preferred workflow, I recommend doing this outside of Cursor. So use like Claude or Gemini or ChatGPT or Grok. I actually use Grok for a lot of my planning stuff. But before you start your project, you should have a document that clearly outlines what you're building, maybe very loosely, like how you want to build it. You don't have to get into tech stack or anything like that, but at least a high level overview, right? So that's something that I would typically include on my own. So I have like an example project overview in here somewhere. Yeah, here we go. So this is what one might look like. This is a very intentionally lean example from Gauntlet, actually. So this is like two phases of a document. It doesn't get into the details of any features, but you could follow this entire setup doc, and you would have by the end of it a complete actionable checklist of how to build your project from top to bottom. So yeah, all those files would go here. And to give an example, here's what another one of my projects looks like now that it's built out. So we have the docs folder. We have all of these. Some of these you'll recognize from the new project setup folder. Others I've added on my own. like Brainlift. Austin, I know you guys are talking with the Gauntlet guys about that right now. So
Yep.
that's something that I update through my projects as I go. That's essentially something that covers my personal views on what I'm building. So if I think a feature is interesting, or if I think it should be built a certain way, right? Or if we have certain information that's guiding that feature, like at Alpha School, right? We use learning science a lot. So if I have any opinions or research on learning science, that goes in my brain lift and is referenced in my workflow. But not really important right now. These are the great documents to have. I also have a resources folder. This is where I keep more arbitrary or temporary files. So I had a brain dump where I just wrote down a bunch of notes one night. I threw it in there so I could reference it if needed. We had some very loose data models I defined at one point, but I don't want them treated as a full document, so I put them here. So yeah.
Yeah, so it's probably worth pointing out this structure is kind of your starter structure, but if there's
Mhm.
more information, you'll create a new, maybe it's relevant in one app and not another. You're not like, oh, this is rigid. You'll add a new doc, you'll reference it wherever you need to. You kind of just you use your docs as a storage for all the rules or all the stuff you want AI to be able to understand at some point.
Absolutely. Your documents are your second brain in a sense, right? They're also your guardrails for your project. So any opinions you have about how the project should be built, or any facts, right? Anything, it should be documented, because otherwise the AI will have very little ability to derive that, right? Even if it's in your files somewhere, if you don't have them organized for you to attach at will, the odds of the AI finding it at the right time, the right place, right? It's kind of low. Um, Even all the time, right? I have these clearly defined docs, but the AI is not going to pull them on its own. Typically, you have to kind of guide it into that. So, but yeah, these are, what is this? Six docs, and then this folder that I have in any project that I ever build. I think they're absolutely essential, and these have been around. Like this sort of recommended structure has been around since like January or earlier. Like people were starting to
Ancient
talk about this
history,
stuff at the start.
January. That's forever ago.
It feels like forever ago, because I had a similar workflow back in January, and I think you even tweeted about this. Like half of it is completely different now than the way it used to be. It all changes so fast out here.
Cool. One thing before, not to interrupt you too much before we get into the nitty gritty, um, cursor rules. How does this differ from cursor rules? What do you do with cursor rules? Or do you use cursor rules at all?
Yeah, so cursor rules, in the way that most people still think of it, I think, is like the dot cursor, if I can type, cursor rules file, right? That used to live in, I think it used to live here. I don't know if people put it in root or what. Uh, Cursor themselves has actually announced that this is like deprecated, and that you should be using dot cursor slash rules. I think in part they've realized like how important these rule documents are for people. So having something more robust, because if you have a dot cursor rules file, it would be absolutely gigantic, right? And as we say in the business, context is everything. So the ability to manage these more fine-grained rules is really important. So I pulled over some examples from another repo. I was using Drizzle in this other repo, and so we created some Drizzle rules for our project. Some of these are best practices from Drizzle, and others are things that we defined ourselves. But stuff like this is really important, right? So I set this as an agent requested rule, and then I give a description. So rules for the Drizzle ORM. So anytime we're working with Drizzle, typically the agent will automatically reference this file. So anytime you have like a something specific in your tech stack, maybe you need to provide more context, or maybe you have personal opinions on how you want the agent to operate, these types of rules are critical. And then to, like I mentioned, put these in the dot cursor slash rules instead of a cursor rules, like a monolith file. So if you go to cursor settings, this is in the rules section. Um, Down here, actually need to have this disabled, but down here, you just click add rule. You give it a name, so test rule, and it'll open up a new markdown file, or a MDC file, which is markdown cursor. But yeah, as an example, I made this GitHub CLI example doc, and I use it to create issues for my code base so that I can literally say at GitHub CLI example, use this to raise a new issue for defining our project's color scheme, right? I actually I don't even know if this computer's hooked up to GitHub, so we'll see if it works. But basically, any workflows or step-by-step instructions you want the agent to have, I would put them in here. And yeah,
Got
looks
it. Awesome.
like this will work great. So,
Great.
oh, never mind. This thinks I'm in. I haven't installed GitHub CLI on this, so never mind. But anyway, you should use this in your own repo. It works pretty well. It'll create issues, read issues, and even resolve issues. It's almost like having like a miniature Devon in your code base.
Awesome. It's going to figure out how to install GitHub for you if you let it run too long.
Oh, so. Yeah. No, it totally will. I don't use this computer for coding right now, so it was a bad example.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, keep on going.
Sure. On the topic of rules, user rules are also pretty important. This is one that they just recently gave us the ability to add multiple. And even here, they say that they recommend like a style request, a response language, or a tone. So this is where you should use stuff that will apply very broadly to your code base, right? Something that is always in context. So you shouldn't have anything here that is not meant for like broad applicability. So I hate how you can't see this very easily. Here, I'll make a new document. So here's just an example of what I have, right? You're an expert in TypeScript, Node.js, Next.js, and AppRouter, right? This is my just standard stack for my code bases. And then I have some instructions for code style and structure. There's some great repositories online that have all sorts of like sample user rules. I don't remember the name of them off the top of my head, but I can find them maybe after this call. But they're super useful. They just kind of back on the guardrail topic, right? They help you silo your code into kind of this like structure that you would want, to the point where I have a senior engineer on my team and he reviews my code all the time. And I always tell him like, oh, I'm not technical. But then he's like, dude, your PRs are like really, really clean. He's like, the code in here, it looks good. Like it's well commented, right? And that's all because I have like these user rules that keep a very consistent structure. So I think that's pretty critical, especially if you want to get familiar with your own code. If it's written in a different structure every time you query the LLM, right? You're kind of just like rolling the dice on what it's going to create. It's going to be harder for you to understand your code base. So I think guardrails are absolutely essential if you're doing any sort of like AI first programming.
Awesome. All right, we got a question here that I think is relevant from Dan. Are you importing and configuring your tech stack from scratch every time you start a new project, or do you have dedicated boilerplate to avoid this setup of things like auth every time?
So right now I'm doing it from scratch. I would recommend boilerplate if you're creating projects that are going to have pretty like similar baselines. During Gauntlet, we're doing a new project every week or two. So boilerplate would have been super useful, but we had very few projects that shared the same structure as the last. So I never had a reason to.
Yeah, we were intentionally trying to switch it up on you, so that became harder.
Exactly.
Okay, I'll stop interrupting and let you drive.
Sure. That's a great question though, and it is a good opportunity. I'll touch on these custom modes that Cursor has. I don't think hardly anyone uses this, but I think they are pretty useful overall. This is Austin, you may recall, I requested this feature from the Cursor team when they came and talked to us.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so like about 3 months later, it was released. And they told me when I suggested it at the time, they were like, "Oh, that's a pretty good idea." I don't have confirmation that led them to develop this feature, but I like to think that it kind of got their brains working. So you can add a custom mode. If you don't have this, it's in the settings chat, maybe. And then custom mode. I looked for this the other day when we were presenting to, oh yeah, here we go. It's a beta feature, but it's not in the beta section. It's in the chat section. You can create specific models, tools, key bindings, and instructions. Most important, in my opinion, is the instructions that are tailored to your workflow. So as an example, I created this scaffold mode. And let me see. Oh, I didn't copy the instructions over. Basically, it has everything in project over no new project setup. So I had, as I mentioned, these steps with these documents. I condensed all of this into an agent mode. So it basically just like one shots it. Like if I give it this whole document, it'll go ahead and produce all of these files just from the project overview. I don't use it often because I like it to be a two-way street, and I'll get into that in a bit of how I like having a lot of conversations with the LLM. But if you have any workflows that you want like automated, this is a really good thing to use. Like for example, I mentioned I have this GitHub CLI workflow. This might work really well as a custom mode. Similarly, I'll just to demo like kind of how it works. This will be I'll just call it gather mode. So what I want it to do is I want it to like understand my code base. So I'm going to take away edit ability, and then I'm going to say you are not, I don't know why this keeps exiting, to write any code. Use tools to explore and understand the code base, and if the user has made a change request, put together a plan for said change, right? So this is just like a prompt, right? If you have a prompt that you use all the time, you could throw it in something like this, and it may have exited out. Let's see. You can set models for it. So like I might want to use O3 max for this because this is a planning instruction essentially. I'll call it plan. It's cleaner than gather. I always think gather like gather context, but O3 max, really good thinking model, right? So we'll just pick that here. GPT-4 might be good for that as well. But anyway, we could say, let's get started with our project. See, what did I call this? Project overview example. Even though it's an example, please proceed with plan. You probably don't need to give it that much context, but basically it's, as you can see, it's a custom model. It won't make a document. It'll just go and, explain what it's going to do by reading the file. So I think that's a fun feature that you should definitely play around with, especially if you're honestly, maybe on either side, if you're an experienced dev that has solid workflows that you want to reuse a lot, or if you're a new dev who finds someone else's workflow, try putting it in a custom model. You might be really pleased with the results. But yeah, it'll just spit out, kind of my plan here. I would prefer it markdown formatted, so typically I'll write this to a file anyway. But yep. Okay, back to the new project setup. Unless we have any pressing questions. Austin, we good?
Yeah, there's one we'll get to later, but
Okay, cool.
I see you, Carlos, but we'll save it for a minute.
Awesome. So I'll just give a high level overview on this. So you start project overview, then you go into the user flow. Again, that's kind of the user journey through the application. Then we get to the tech stack section. So we tell it anything that we know we want to use. So I have, TypeScript, React, Tailwind as examples here. And then for each part of the stack, I have it propose an industry standard and a popular alternative. So this is a good way, especially for a new developer, to kind of learn what your options are. Instead of industry standard and proposed alternative, you could say like industry standard and open source alternative, or anything that you might want to deviate from the industry standard. Typically, I'd recommend industry standard if you're a new developer, just because the agents are or the LLMs know the industry standards better, right? There's just more code available with that stuff to train them on. But like I know one of my friends from Gauntlet is like diehard Svelte, right? He would be very sad if we always just requested industry standards, because the AI would always just say React, right? Oh, use React. Popular alternative, right? Or open source alternative would be Svelte, I think, right? Svelte's open source. And new developers would never discover that, right? If they're just relying on AI recommendations all the time. And I've found many new things to add to my tech stack through this approach, getting like a popular or open source alternative. So, would definitely recommend doing this step, even if you know what you're going to build and what you want to use. After that, I have it update that tech stack document with every best practice, limitation, and convention that it can think of for each of the technologies. This is more for my learning. It can sometimes be useful for reinforcing the model, but overall, it's probably an anti pattern because, like, the model created these in the first place, right? It's the one writing the best practices in there. So it's probably not going to look back at the document later and find something new that wasn't already in its knowledge base. But I really like reading through this so that I know what to look for and what to avoid, stuff like that. Next is the UI UX section. So the UI rules document that's produced by this is more probably in the UX realm because it defines like here are certain like breakpoints for our screen sizes, right? Here are the different components that we want to adhere to. Here's kind of a loose overview of how we're going to set up like our component architectures. Whereas the theme guide is the one I use more, which are the colors and just the overall theming of the code base, right? So like we have some examples here of minimalistic, glassmorphic, neumorphic. These are all different like styles that you might use. But this is really great because right off the bat, you've described how you want your components to look and how you want them to be styled and colored. And so even if you're making just a hello world application, it's going to look really pretty from the start. And this is great because you can just drop it in context anytime you're building a component, and it'll automatically be formatted the way that you want your project's theme to be. A easy pairing with this is ShadCN because you can make your reusable components from the start, right, and theme them really nicely. But even if you're not using ShadCN, like even for mobile app development, this was great because you're creating a lot of components that are kind of independent of one another. And so if you're using like a central theme, this is great for getting it to adhere to that. And then real quick, I'll go through these last two. So this is one that a couple of the cohort two people really seem to like. I know one of them said that this is, in their opinion, the most important document here. Um, I hear people talk about this every once in a while. For a long time, I've used the term an AI first code base. So, what that means is I want to set up all my code bases to be very easily explored by the agent, right? Especially several months ago, I did not know where all my code was. I had a hard time navigating my larger code bases, and I needed to really rely on the agent to find the relevant files, which sometimes goes against naming conventions, right? Or uh, structural conventions for projects. So I forget what all the tools are nowadays, but the agent has the ability to like grep your code base and use like string matching and all sorts of exploration techniques to find relevant files, folders, and whatnot. So this document, this code base, what is it? Code base structure, maybe uh, project rules. I used to call it code base organization, and it was way too long, so I cut it down to project rules. Um, but basically, this is a nice way to make it very search optimized for the agent. So highly navigable. The code is well organized, easy to read. I keep all my files under 500 lines. That way, they're easily included in context. Otherwise, it won't provide like the entire file. That cutoff used to be like 250 lines, and it's kind of changed over time. I don't even know that 500 is a clear cutoff anymore, but I like it just for the sake of keeping my files modular. Um, and then I also want to do these kind of JS doc and TS doc comment blocks above all my files, functions, stuff like that, because it helps me understand them as well as the agent. And then lastly, this is like the whole checklist thing. I have it, you know, this is long, so I won't go through the whole thing. I feel like I've kind of blabbed for a minute, but this outlines kind of your entire checklist from start to finish for how you're going to build the project. Really important is I have this set up to keep these phases iterative so that each one builds on itself. I want a working product through every phase of my project. through Gauntlet, I used the checklist structure, which this is also a checklist structure. And it'll look like this. So you can see over here, you've got like, this is just a setup phase. So you've got like the overview, and then you've got the checks, and then it'll mark them when they're finished, and so on and so forth. This is a pretty long one. The setup phase is always very long for my projects because I like to do everything up front. But if you do it through, if you try and do, how do I want to explain it? If you try and make your phases feature based, sometimes you'll risk not having a usable product along the way because one feature may not work until another one's developed. So even though these are relatively feature based, I try to separate it into the setup phase and then like an MVP phase and then like several more like expansion phases on top of that. That way the thing actually works all the way through delivery. And that's pretty much the scaffolding approach of my code bases. They all start with these steps that I've outlined here every single time, and it's worked really well for me.
That's awesome. All right, we'll go to Carlos's question real quick. I hear a lot of hype around using the Roo/Klein extensions to help plan and even save on tokens. Does this fit into this flow at all?
So I don't use Roo or Klein. Even in Gauntlet, I don't know that we really had anyone who did. I checked out Klein at one point. It's great. It's definitely something for saving cost. Typically for planning and stuff, I'll just take it outside of the IDE. So I don't know how badly this is still the case, but Cursor like kind of cuts down the context windows, probably just to save on cost, right? They minimize the number of tokens. Um, so you're probably better off for any serious planning. Take it into whatever your preferred model is, whether that's ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini. I think it's just cheaper that way in general. And it's also just a better context window. Like we had a guy in Gauntlet, Tyler, who made TinyVec, his own like vector database, right? The dude's insanely cracked. And as opposed to using Klein, he just used VS Code and then pulled out whatever context into Claude himself. Like he would use the I guess he had the app, like the actual app for Claude. Um, but I think anytime you're trying to save costs or manage context like super effectively, do that. Pull it out into your preferred LLM. But Klein's great. It's a good option for anyone who wants to try it.
Cool.
And then yeah, kind of on that topic, it's great. I mentioned at the start to kind of find your own workflow. That was his workflow, right, during Gauntlet. But as with everyone in Gauntlet, he was constantly reassessing it. So like now he does use Cursor because he's kind of figured out how to manage the context in the way that he likes within Cursor, which is great. I think he still pulls stuff into Claude if he needs to, but overall, it's cool to see people's like methodologies change over time. Kind of on the flip side of that, we had a guy, Michael, who Austin you may know as well. He was in Gauntlet. He was like an engineering only background, had not done any programming, and he was one of the best engineers to come out of Gauntlet, in my opinion. And I think Ash may have told him that as well, because he was dedicated to like understanding the code that the agent was producing. I think that's maybe the most beneficial thing you can do when you're relying on agents very heavily for your code is ask as many questions as you can and understand what it's actually doing. If you just let it write code all day, right? As soon as you hit a bug, debugging becomes very difficult. I think that's like by the end of week 1 in Gauntlet, that's always everyone's number one question is how do you get unstuck? The best way to get unstuck is to have a little bit of understanding of your code base yourself, right? So you can provide the correct context. Um, but I liked Michael's workflow a lot because he was constantly learning from the LLM. Um, and then also another example I wanted to mention is like my old boss. He uses Claude Code for everything. He like does not like Cursor, right? And he's incredibly experienced. Whereas I can't stand Claude Code because I think Claude just in general tries to make way too many changes. So it's really really good at getting stuff done fast, but it doesn't feel as surgical to me as Gemini. But I'm over here trying to be surgical when this dude's got 20 years of coding experience and thinks that like quad code is by far the best and that there's never a reason to use cursor. So that's kind of, in my opinion, a testament of find what works best for you, because everyone's a little bit different.
Awesome. All right. Okay, so now we got project set up. We've got all the docs in the right place. I guess first, when you're doing all of this planning, what other, outside of Cursor and the tools it has, you just use ChatGPT? What are your favorite models? What are your favorite workflows for that?
So if I'm doing anything that's like my own idea, I'll typically dump it into Grok, which I don't think is a super popular method. I like it because I like the conversational style of Grok, so I feel like I get more out of it. I feel like it's more of a two-way street where it'll present information, I'll ask it a question, and so we kind of like form the document as we go. And then anytime I'm doing this like kind of setup step, I'll have it summarize the conversation at the end. And again, this is super, I think a lot of people do this, right? Have a conversation with an LLM, summarize it at the end, and then pull it into your project. So just copy and paste it as a document, right? So that could be your PRD, that could be a project overview, that could be a brain dump, right? Whatever you want to call it. But I think all of that provides really good context for your cursor agent, right? Um, for a lot of the stuff we do at Alpha School, I mentioned we want to bake learning science into our stuff, right? So we're doing a lot of research as well. So like using different models for research is really useful. Grok Deep Research is good. Um, I think a lot of people don't care for Perplexity, but I've been using Perplexity just because it's quick and simple for just like answering basic questions about learning science and whatnot. So I know a lot of people that like to take their stuff outside the IDE for their planning phases. I think, in fact, ChatGPT is probably the best one if you have like the premium account. I don't, so I don't really use that much. But I have a friend who works in like sales and marketing, and he's been using it like nonstop for everything. And he actually recently started using Cursor and uses this workflow, and he's built several applications already. And he does all of his stuff in ChatGPT. Outs Anything outside of the IDE, he uses ChatGPT for it, and I'm very impressed with the results. So I think that's probably a subscription that's worth the money.
Awesome. And then when you're coding, so okay, we've got projects set up. Take us through some of like how you will include these documents or how you'll reference them as you're building. And I mean, just we don't want to spend forever and have you actually build a full app. Maybe that's for another day. But yeah, now that you've got kind of this scaffold in place of all these different docs and a good project requirements and project rules and hierarchy and user flow, then what?
Yeah, so as I'm going, I do kind of what's very similar to what I've mentioned in these prompts, which is I'll just reference the files down here, right? I'll say, hey, use these files to do this task. Um, as far as like anatomy of a prompt, I don't know that that stuff's as important as it used to be. For O1, I know it was massively important where you had to structure your prompts a certain way. Typically, I'll put the files either at the start or at the end of my prompt, right? So I guess I don't have these actual docs created in this repo, but I'll go back to the GitHub CLI example, right? I would say like use GitHub CLI to raise a new issue for, blank. And then I would say the relevant code is in, and then I would at reference some files here. That's really common for like kind of a one-off task that I'm trying to accomplish. However, if I'm trying to address like a larger feature, um, so I'll use the GitHub CLI example again. I use this to create issues in my like GitHub project. So I would have it grab the issue. So I have let me open up the CLI example. So I have like these instructions in here for how to view issues in the repository. So I would say, hey, grab the issue from this. And then I'd be like, okay, let's get started. Let's get started on resolving the issue. Pretend there's already some chat started here. And then I'll use this button to add context that's persisted throughout the entire chat. The reason this matters is because I can say, let's get started on the issue. I link the README, right? And if I hit enter, you'll see that that file is no longer in context down here. So at reference a file if you want it just used for like a single message, right? However, if you want this persisted through the entire chat, you should add it up here. So let's say we're going to do a lot of work on our README. Oh, I kind of bugged out this chat window. Let's say we're doing a lot of work on our README. I'll attach it up here and I'll say, let's make some changes to the README, right? And then you'll see it's still attached down here. So files that are commonly used for this, I would say from the new project setup would be the tech stack, right? Because oftentimes, anytime you're making a change to your code base, it's probably going to touch some sort of package or library. So keeping the tech stack file in permanent context is really good, which we don't have it, so I can't attach it here. And then the project overview is usually pretty good as well. Even though that doesn't explicitly tell the AI where any files are, I think it's still really good for helping it understand the context that it's working in of just like what your larger project is. Typically, if it has to call in extra files or folders, if it has some understanding of your project as a whole without having to explore your code base in the first place, I think that'll help it find it more effectively. Obviously, it's really hard to measure some of this stuff because there's no good metrics or whatever, which is kind of where like the whole vibe coding thing comes from, right? You just kind of got to do what works for you. But attaching the tech stack in almost all cases and then a project overview in almost all cases has been super useful. Anytime I'm making a new component, I'll attach the theme rules. Every once in a while, I'll attach the UI rules. I don't use it that much. And then if it puts a file in the wrong place, that's another thing I mentioned earlier. Always learn from the AI, right? Similarly, always review what the AI is doing. It's kind of a pain to look through all the outputs all the time, but at the very least, look at where it's putting files. That's something that in Gauntlet, I was surprised by how many times the AI would put the file in the wrong folder or make like a new folder for a file that we already had, either a similar file or a similar folder or whatever. So to keep your sanity, I would double check where all of that's done. And then if it's in a weird spot, just link the project rules because this is supposed to define your folder structure, file naming conventions, and whatnot. Typically, I include like a file tree in there as well. That's mentioned down here somewhere, right here. Um, so highly recommend that. But I'll touch on this, which I know you shared on Twitter. This is obviously always subject to change. This is different from what it was 3 months ago, but I think it's still pretty true based on just experimentation. So this is what I've referred to as the rule inclusion hierarchy. I've we have it in this like little pyramid here, so I'll just go top to bottom and explain kind of the difference between each one. So you have your cursor mode, which is effectively the system prompt, right? This is what typically cursor handles in the background. You can find the cursor system prompt like online. People have already like leaked it or hacked it or whatever, however you want to say it, prompt engineered it out of the model. Um, this takes precedence. If you ever worked with like the OpenAI API, you'll know that like there's kind of there's the system prompt and then there's user prompts, right? The system prompt trumps everything. All the conversations are started off with the system prompt. So you don't really need to interact with the system prompt on your own unless you're making a custom agent. I don't think it replaces the system prompt, but I think it's attached to it. But that's like number one. That'll be more important than everything. I just zoomed in. How do I zoom out? Okay, cool. There we go. Can you see this okay? I kind of messed with the sizing.
Yeah, I can see great.
All right, cool. So then you've got user rules and cursor notepads. These seem to be on the same level. So these are always active if you put them in context and they're user selected. So, well, sorry, I misspoke. User rules are always active. Cursor notepads are user selected because I've labeled these like respectively. So user rules are the ones I mentioned here. in the settings, you've got the rules, and then your user rules. This is like the user prompt. I think it's even attached when you send like a request, like if you type a chat, right? This is attached as a user rule in the hierarchy, like that. I think it's XML, the XML that's provided to the LLM. So this has like special privilege in there. So these are most important. Again, these apply very broadly to like everything that you do. Similarly, cursor notepads are this random feature that I've hardly seen anyone use. And they're really neat because they work similarly to your docs. So like, you see we have these docs down here, the cursor rules and whatnot, but they're treated on the same level as the user rules. They have high visibility in your prompts. So one thing that I'll actually do in some of my projects is I'll say like directory guide or something like that. And it's nice because you can reference other files in your code base in this document. So the notepads are a little bit special in that regard. If you were to make a normal document, I'll say it's a markdown file. So referencing at docs example, right? You don't get any actual like link to that document. I don't know how Cursor manages this in the background, but I can say use docs example, and it actually will reference it here. So again, I don't know how it provides that and what it looks like in the background, but it's really nice because you can tell the agent exactly where to look for certain documents. So typically I'll use this as a directory guide, and I will say use project overview for a high level overview of the project, right? Use user flow for navigation. Use tech stack for information about the complexities of the project's tech stack, right? Those sorts of things. And then I'll just attach it up here. So I would say, does this count yet? Yeah, so I haven't named it. So it's just new notepad. You can rename it by going up here. So you can attach that to permanent context, and it'll be treated just like your user rules in terms of importance, but you can remove and attach it at will, which is really handy in my opinion. Getting back into the hierarchy, then you have the cursor rules, which are these right here, which have replaced the dot cursor rules file. These can be referenced in three different ways. You can do glob patterns, you can do user selection, or you can do by request. So glob patterns means, or short for like global, I think. But you can say, okay, I want this to be attached anytime there is a markdown cursor file. This isn't actually what you would do for this because this is a RLS rule thing. Star.sql. Do I need quotes or something? Anyway, not important. Oh my god, I can't type right now. Anyway, so you can set which types of files you want this rule to be attached with. For something like the Superbase RLS policies, you can set it to attach anytime you're working with a SQL file, and RLS policies are stored as SQL files, so it's good to have it that way. And the agent will automatically reference these when it's making such files, which is super handy. And then you've got the user selection, which means that you can just mention it yourself, right? So if you make a rule like drizzle rules, you can attach it here, and then the agent will have it in context. Or AI request, which is right here. So you give a description of the file. So this one is guidelines for writing Postgres for level security policies. And if you're lucky, when you're doing something with RLS, the agent will recognize that it's RLS and that we have documentation for that. I haven't found that to be as reliable. I typically stay away from agent requested. I either do auto attach with a glob or I'll do manual and I just attach it myself. Continuing with the hierarchy, you have attached. Oh, and then I also have the persisted or not persisted thing in here. I think some people asked questions about that last time I posted this. So persisted means it'll remain in the chat context, whether you're reattaching it or not. So like every time you send a new message, if I have something labeled as persisted here, it means that it's included in future messages without you having to explicitly attach it. Whereas if something is not persisted, it means that it goes away if you haven't included it again. So for example, attached files are the ones that are attached up here in the header. These will remain as attachments even in the next message, right? So they're all here again. Whereas mentioned files will not be persisted. So I'm going to say at, what do we have? Drizzle rules, right? It is up here, but it's not persisted, so it's going to fall down here because this is a mentioned file. This is something that is not critical to know. It really will only come into play if your chats get very, very long, or not even very long, just reasonably long. But typically, you should avoid that anyway, because if your chats are covering more than one feature, just make a new one always.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how often do you tend to create a new chat?
Yeah, so I keep chats scoped to tasks or features. I don't go beyond that unless it's just like really cooking. Every once in a while, I will do like great exploration of the code base at the start. And so I feel like the model has really good background for what we're working on. Then I'll tackle a couple features in the same chat. But typically I recommend splitting it up as much as you can. So unless you have very valuable information in one chat that you want to continue operating on, make a new one. And even then, you can summarize a chat. I don't know if I have enough content in any of these to summarize them. There might even, I think at one point there was like a command you could use to summarize one and carry it into the next. But if a chat gets sufficiently long, Cursor will pop up a message right here that says, create a new chat, like summarize this one and include it. It'll include a summary of the previous chat. I don't love that feature. It's the summaries are usually like pretty bad, and it'll grab a lot of context from like random parts of the chat in an attempt to summarize it. And especially if you're debugging, right, some of the context could just be dead wrong, because if you're continuing a debugging loop, typically that means that not everything's going perfectly.
You literally could have changed it since then. It's going to grab incorrect information. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So I don't use the summarize feature super often. But to each their own. On
Awesome.
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
On the topic of like bug resolution, because a lot of people have asked me about that. Always create it. So step one, always create a new chat. You should probably, well, if the bug is related to a change that was just made, tackle it in the same chat, right? Don't have context for your recent changes and then like dump them and make a new chat. If your recent changes are relevant, keep it in the same chat. But if you're encountering a bug later in development that you missed earlier, always start with clean context, and then always start. I use these custom modes now, so I'll use like the planning mode, and I'll say like, hey, gather information about what we're working on. Here's a file or two that would be useful. But one essential thing is always say use tools. So if you're having the agent explore the code base, I don't know if Cursor has some stuff in their prompt that discourages the agents from using a ton of tools, because if it used them very liberally, it would cost a lot of money and people may not like that. So I think it's a little hesitant to like tool max. But if you just tell it like, hey, use tools to explore the code base, that's what I've found to be the most effective for gathering context. Because it can.
What kind of tools is that referring to?
So Cursor has like these built-in tools. Like when you build an agent, you provide it with tools, and Cursor's done essentially that. So they have these like read file tools. They have edit file. They have MCP. They've got all these things that your agent can plug into that enable it to be agentic, right? So one of the most frequently used tools is just the code base exploration set. So there's like the grep one, there's the read file one. These are things that allow it to kind of work through your code base. And I always just encourage it to use them because I want it to use as many as possible. I want it to explore several directories, right? If you don't tell it to use tools and you just say, hey, explore the code base a little bit, it'll pick like a folder or two or maybe a few files. But if you really tell it to just go wild and just say like, hey, use as many tool calls as possible, it'll actually gather a lot of really useful context. So I've gotten in the habit of anytime I make a new chat, I always have it explore the code base first, to the point where I even have that in my user rules of, whenever you're making a change, always explore the code base first, stuff like that. But yeah, these tool calls are useful. So when I'm debugging, explore the code base first, and then identify the target, right? So wherever the bug is occurring, and then do your best to supply it with as many files as you think it'll need off the rip. The agent will do its own job of gathering relevant files, but the more you can provide it with, the better, because the less tool calls it needs to make. So you save money and you tighten up the context, right? It'll work just with the files you've given it instead of pulling in a bunch of other stuff to make decisions. Um, and then if you're really, really stuck, I think the best approach is to take it outside of the IDE. So if you've at least narrowed down the relevant files, copy all of those and pull them into Claude, right? Or pull them into Gemini or ChatGPT. And then you get the full context window. And I've seen people have a lot of success with tackling very difficult bugs just by getting out of Cursor. So don't get stuck in like this like debug hell where you're going down like a super long chat and then, oh, this didn't work, try this. This didn't work, try that. Just pull it out into a different LLM, right? On that topic, though, there are a couple things that can help debugging a lot and to avoid future bugs. So if I've gone down a very long chat where I've worked on a difficult bug, or if the agent keeps messing up something that is like true for our code base. So one example is like I use npm for my code base. I know a lot of people like Bun right now too, but the AI actually has a tendency to try to use Yarn. So if I've gone through several times where it's trying to use Yarn for this or Yarn for that, I'll say, hey, we're using npm. Like create a document that explains what we're using and why we're using it. So then that's how I've mentioned, my docs will grow throughout a project. If I encounter like an error loop like this, and that's a basic example because it's a dependency, but if it's like a feature, you can do the same thing. Where if you have a feature that behaves a certain way, pull it out into a document. That way you can provide it to the LLM so it doesn't make the same mistake again. That's like a critical debugging step, in my opinion.
Fascinating. So if you see it making the same mistake too many times, you turn that into a doc or a rule or whatever and limit
Yeah,
it that way. That makes a ton of sense. Yeah,
totally.
I wouldn't have thought to do that.
Um,
Cool.
yeah, so you kind of eliminate these bad paths by telling the AI in advance, like, hey, we've gone down this path before. Don't do it again because it won't work. Um, One last thing on debugging, if you're going down a lot of chats and let's see. So like here, well, we haven't made any changes, so there's no checkpoints to restore. But if you make changes to a file um, in a prompt up here, there'll be like this little restore checkpoint option at the bottom. When you're going through a debugging phase, try expanding your chat downwards. And then if you don't reach a resolution, don't keep going down that same chat because you have all these like bad examples and bad paths previously and the model will start to like kind of grab the wrong context. Typically, you're better off just trying to like one shot it again from the start. And you can update it with context as you want, right? If it tries something that doesn't work, just restore your checkpoint to go to a previous chat. And then you can say, okay, like we've already tried this, now try that. That's typically way more effective than continuing down a very long chat window because it just waters down your context.
Got it. So you say, okay, actually back up, undo all of that. Here's some more context. Let's try again instead of fixing what was fixed incorrectly.
Yeah, exactly. It's like version control, but within Cursor, right? In the background, Cursor's using its own version control to map like the different changes it's made. So you can always revert to a previous state and then just try it again.
Awesome. Well, I think we've taken more than enough of your time, Palmer. Thank you for being willing to spend some time with us and walk through all of this. As you can tell, there's a lot going on. There's a lot that you can learn. There's a lot that I'm sure this will be different 6 months from now, and we'll have to have Palmer come back and explain what's changed with Cursor and the models and how everything works. But yeah, thank you for your time. And if you are interested in hanging out for a few weeks with 100 or so people that are like Palmer, you can always apply to Gauntlet AI or hire from Gauntlet AI if you want someone like Palmer in your company. So thank you all, and we'll end the stream. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.